So first things first is you're going to want some fine charcoal. This is what you're going to use to outline your drawing and get started. Something else that you're going to need is this alpha color compressed charcoal. Now this is my favorite one to get my darkest blacks. As you can see, it's pretty pitch black. Works really well for that. I also have the alpha color in white. That is for your highlights. And then I have some normal compressed charcoal sticks. These are broken up. Next, you'll need some blending tools. They can really be whatever kind. These are the ones that I tend to use the most for my drawings. These General charcoal pencils are the ones that I tend to use. I use, I'd say, 2B the most. And the way that I sharpen them is I use an X-Acto blade carefully, and then I sharpen with this tool here. You can see it's like a piece of sandpaper, really. That's all you need. You don't have to go out and buy that. It also works for removing from the charcoal blending sticks. Another thing is a chamois cloth. So I use this when I start up my drawing, as you can see. And I also use it to remove charcoal. That's what the lighter part of the chamois cloth is for. For erasing, here are my major tools. So I have my kneaded eraser. This is the best thing you can use because you can have it shaped to any size you need, as small as you want it to be. You can see here, or as thick as you want it to be. This Factus magic eraser is quite actually magic. It removes almost all the charcoal from the paper. And then for some detail work, I have these. Once again, Factus. This one's a little bit thicker. And this is the Tombow Mono 0 eraser. It's a lot thinner. You don't really need this one. I get along just fine with this one, but they both work really well. As for making lines, you want to have some rulers. These two work just fine for me. And masking tape. Now, masking tape I use primarily for creating a frame in my drawing. A lot of people use drafting tape, but masking tape from the dollar store works just as well. All I do is grab some fabric and tape it on a couple times, and you do that and it picks up the fibers and it makes it less sticky so that it doesn't rip up your paper. Now, as far as charcoal paper goes, I used this one. You don't really have to use charcoal paper. You just want to make sure you use a paper that has like a tooth to it so that it can pick up the charcoal, because with smoother paper you'll find it a little bit more difficult, but definitely doesn't make it impossible. One last thing is you want to use a workable fixative at the end. When you're done with your drawing, you just want to make sure that you're done erasing, because after you spray this you won't be able to erase as well. And last thing you want is some scrap paper. So this is newsprint paper I got from the art supply store. You can use anything. For example, I have the crafting paper also from the Dollar Tree. Just anything you want to anchor your hand on if you are drawing on a flat surface so that you don't rub all over your drawing and mess it up. I also use a paper sometimes as a flat line when I'm rubbing out charcoal so that I have a crisp line when I remove it. So for reference, I'm using a real-life composition of objects and observing from life. My focus this session is to thumbnail a small composition. My thumbnail will reflect just a portion of the full stage of objects to create a dynamic composition that is not too busy. I used a viewfinder made out of cardboard, and then I took a picture of my portion of the objects for future reference. I also did a small value study of the skull as a little practice sketch, along with a value scale for reference. You can also use a reference image, but for the sake of this project, I'm working on my observational skills. I did have a picture reference of the objects for the sake of being able to work on the project from home, but it was just a guide for lighting and not meant for copying. So I started off by taping the perimeter of the paper to create a frame around the drawing once it's finished. Then I started to tone the paper, like prepping a canvas for a painting. I used the Alpha Color Deep Black compressed charcoal and smudging it out with my fingers so that it stains a darker color. Otherwise, I find that using just the chamois cloth tends to remove too much charcoal, and I have to go back with the stick multiple times. But once I do that, then I take my chamois cloth and make everything a more even tone. So for the grid method, I'm using a simple 3x3 grid on my thumbnail and transferring over to my larger paper. I already sorted out the proportions on my thumbnail, so I'm simply using it as a guide for my outline. You can use vinyl or a pen eraser for this. For the outline, I'm going in with fine charcoal. I start outlining my objects, and when I start laying them down, I try to think about constructing the basic shapes and forms. I'm looking at my thumbnail as reference and using the photo to help fill in the gaps. In this drawing, I skipped a little over the basic construction and focused more on the outlines because the perspective was pretty basic for me, and I understood how the shapes looked in the space in order to transfer them over to my paper. You can see me struggle a little bit here with my cube, and it's bringing back the grueling memories of the Drawbox challenge, but I simply just use this spare paper to sort out the perspective of it. I even did some of the structural lines or contour lines on some of the objects to help lay down the shadows correctly later on. So for value, this session was all about using value, light, and shadow to convey shape and dimension, starting off with something simple like spheres. I kind of half-assed my spheres, to be honest, because I've done this so many times, that's why they look crappy, but you get the general idea. Here I'm using my chamois cloth and erasers to remove charcoal and get an understanding of how lights and shadows are wrapping around the forms. So after 1 hour, not much done. I'm slow at working, but this is an image of everything I got done. So now that I'm back home, I'm further developing the drawing by removing charcoal to pull the light and then going back in with the blacks to add contrast. My main method here is to start with a basic gray tone, which is the middle of the value scale, go in and laying out my lightest whites on one end of the value scale and then the opposite end of the darkest darks and filling in the gaps. This makes it fairly easy and faster to complete a drawing, but once I have all that laid in, I just focus on blending and adding more complex shadow forms. This is when I start to use my charcoal pencils and my blending sticks. But yeah, after that I just start rendering out the details like small folds and wrinkles in the fabric and texture of the aluminum can. I wouldn't say my details are super rendered. There's kind of an impressionistic level of detail that tricks the eye to think it's more detailed than it truly is. For example, I didn't render every single wrinkle on the cloth or every single stroke of light bouncing off the can. I don't know how else to put it other than I just push and pull the charcoal until I essentially sculpt it just right. Here's an image of the finished drawing. It just helps me to remember the structure of a shadow, remembering that the core shadow is much darker than the rest of the shadow and sits right next to the lightest part of the form, and so on. This produces dimension. For final touches, I was very careful with using the white charcoal. Honestly, I might have used it a tad bit too much, but it should be used very sparingly when doing the additive reductive method because it is a lot more opaque and cooler in tone compared to the rest of the drawing. But voila! Once you're done, you just spray it with the fixative and it will set in place and no longer smudge. For my final comments, my only regret is that I sprayed it with the fixative a bit too soon and couldn't carve out my highlights more. I would have wanted to pull the highlights more to create more contrast, especially in the skull. And that's where I got carried away with using the white charcoal, but it's okay. That's why these are made for learning.